December of 1989, Carrie O'Brien Kruger was living with her husband Tracy and their 3-year-old daughter Megan in Burlington, Wisconsin. At the time, the 31-year-old mother was working in the public relations department of Gander Mountain, an outdoor retail company known as Gander Outdoors. According to Tracy, Carrie's coworker called her on the evening of December 5th, asking her to join them for a trade show in Wyoming the next day. It would be a last-minute trip as she was replacing a coworker who couldn't make. She packed her suitcase that night and planned to leave 4:30 a.m. the next morning to drive to Chicago, Illinois, where she would meet up with another coworker and catch a flight from O'Hare International Airport. She planned to return the following Sunday. Tracy remembered Carrie saying goodbye to him before she left on the morning of December 6th. A neighbor recalled seeing a black car outside of Carrie's home around 4:30 a.m. with a man in the driver's seat. According to their daughter Megan, the neighbor also said that she saw Carrie get into the car, but it's unclear what series of events is correct. Later that morning, Tracy got a call from one of Carrie's coworkers, asking where she was and why she hadn't shown up to work. Tracy told them that Carrie was at a trade show in Wyoming, only to find out that there was no trade show scheduled for that date, and that Carrie was not asked to attend any event at that time. So where had Carrie gone? Tracy then called Carrie's sister, Molly, to ask if Carrie was with her, which she wasn't. Molly encouraged Tracy to call the rest of her family and see if Carrie was with them, and then to call the police. But Tracy didn't want to call the police just yet, as he believed Carrie would be back soon. The next day, Tracy went with Carrie's parents to the police station and they officially reported her as missing. During the investigation, the police searched Carrie's home but found no evidence related to her disappearance. Many of her personal belongings were still there, including her brand new makeup, winter coat, and everyday hair tools. They did, however, notice that Carrie and Tracy's mattress was missing. When questioned, Tracy said that he'd bought a waterbed to surprise Carrie with upon her return because she'd always wanted one. Her family found that suspicious because Carrie was very frugal and wouldn't have been happy with the purchase. The original mattress was never located. Friends and family say Carrie and Tracy's marriage was in trouble. There was no evidence of abuse, but Carrie had previously told friends that she was going to consider divorce if things didn't improve. Before Carrie disappeared, Tracy had purchased a truck in their name and didn't tell Carrie about it. They believe Tracy forged Carrie's signature on the loan document and told her it was borrowed from a friend since she wouldn't have agreed to buy it. Some suspect that Carrie found out about the purchase and it caused an escalating fight on the night of December 5th. Their daughter Megan said that she doesn't believe her father was involved in her mother's disappearance. She said that her dad grieved for many years after Carrie disappeared and that he'd been heartbroken. Carrie was a former journalist and an editor for the Burlington Standard Press, and she once wrote a story about changing identities, leading some to believe that she left to start a new life. Megan also said that after reviewing her mother's journal, she believes she left on her own accord. "We really truly believe that she left," she said. "From reading her diaries, and I do understand that the amount I have are from a very young age from her, from middle school through high school. She seemed very depressed." But the rest of Carrie's family doesn't believe she abandoned her husband and daughter. Some believe that she was being poisoned before she disappeared. As Carrie had been having an unknown gastrointestinal issues that doctors could never identify the cause of. Megan has also gastrointestinal issues that flare up when she gets stressed, which she suspects is the same issue her mother had. Carrie's brother Pat said that many family members believe Tracy is responsible. "My sister would not leave Megan," he said. "Everybody believes that he did it, and it is certainly not her fault." The question remains, did Carrie lie about the trade show and leave on her own? Or did Tracy lie about the trade show to cover up a crime? Tracy said that Carrie traveled for business fairly often over the years, and he would take time off work to look after their daughter Megan, but according to Carrie's employer, she had only been scheduled to attend one out-of-town business trip back in 1987. At the last minute, saying Carrie had a chance to go to Alaska on a business trip, so he'd have to watch Megan. But when a friend asked Carrie about the Alaska trip, she knew nothing about it. Carrie's sisters also said that according to phone records, no call came in the night of December 6th from colleagues asking Carrie to join them from the trade show, as Tracy had said. According to Molly, for months after Carrie went missing, Carrie was bloody men's pajama shirt and slippers were found in a neighboring county. Her family didn't recognize the shirt, but Molly said that Tracy was known for wearing pajamas and slippers in a similar style. The analysis concluded that there was human blood on the shirt and that it matched Carrie's blood type, but the shirt was not put into evidence. Tracy took a polygraph test in 1990, which was inconclusive. He was scheduled to take another test, but it was canceled after he was hospitalized due to severe mental health issue, which he claimed caused him to forget the last 10 years of his life. Because of this, he has never been asked to take another polygraph test. Heather Springer of the Racine County Sheriff's Office is the current investigator on the case. She said that when detectives learned that Tracy had replaced the bed and couldn't locate the original mattress, the investigation turned from police suspecting Carrie left voluntarily to suspecting something else. She also stated that in 1992, Tracy's brother confided in someone that Tracy had killed Carrie. The person went to the police and reported it, but Tracy's brother said it was a joke and that he had no knowledge of what happened to Carrie. Investigators also found that Carrie and Tracy were connected to a man who'd been charged with kidnapping and murder in the 1960s. They interviewed the man but concluded he was not a person of interest. After Carrie disappeared, her parents received a fake severed finger in the mail and a CD with Guns N' Roses song, "Used to Love Her" on it. The song contained the lyrics, "I used to love her, but I had to kill her." No one was able to determine who sent the items to the family. The investigation into the disappearance of Carrie O'Brien Kruger is still ongoing, and no arrests have been made. Her story has been featured on Dateline NBC and the true crime podcast, Vanished. Carrie's family is still hopeful that one day they will have answers. Her sister Molly said, "I love to think that she is out there somewhere, happy and healthy. But in my heart, I know that is not true. We all accepted that a long time ago. If there is someone who knows something, please come forward." Sheriff Springer encourages anyone with information about Carrie's disappearance or whereabouts to contact her directly at the Racine Sheriff's Office or anonymously at Crime Stoppers. What do you think about it? Tell us your thoughts in comments below. Let's continue. It has been over 6 months and friends and family, as well as volunteers, are still combing the Arizona desert in search of 24-year-old Daniel Robinson. Daniel was last seen on June 23, 2021 at around 9:15 a.m. He was leaving a job site in Buckeye, Arizona, where he was working as a geologist. Friends and family described Daniel as a scientist with a passion for adventure. He traveled often, but would always check in with family along the way, which made his disappearance all the more concerning. According to his family, Daniel had plans to visit his family in July and was excited about the meeting. He was seen by federal law enforcement officials cleaning his Jeep that morning and said that Daniel seemed clear-headed. He also spoke with his colleague, Kenneth, at a job site near Sun Valley Parkway on Cactus. Kenneth told police that Daniel was acting strange. During their 15-minute conversation, Daniel reportedly said that things didn't make sense and stared into the distance before leaving abruptly. Kenneth later contacted their project manager Steve, who said no one had seen or heard from Daniel that day. By around 3 p.m., he still wasn't responding to texts or calls from work or family, so Kenneth set out to look for Daniel in the desert. He found tire tracks that he believed to be Daniel's and followed them out west to a large desert area. One of Daniel's co-workers went to Daniel's sister's apartment in Phoenix to check if he was there, but he wasn't. His sister then called their father, David Robinson, who called the Buckeye Police Department to report Daniel missing. But the police had a policy that missing persons could only be reported after 12 hours of disappearing, so he had to wait another 3 hours before calling back and putting in the official report. And then he packed a bag and headed to Arizona from South Carolina to search for his son himself. Over the next few days, the Buckeye police conducted several ground searches and aerial searches near Daniel's job site, searched his apartment, reviewed his financial records, and attempted to ping his cell phone from a location and retrieve GPS data from his Jeep. But there was no sign of Daniel. Police began to question Daniel's mental state for his disappearance. According to reports, all of the posts on Daniel's Instagram profile had been deleted before he disappeared. They also questioned whether a recent romance may have played a factor. Daniel had met a girl while delivering groceries for Instacart. They swapped phone numbers, and according to her, Daniel began to get creepy, and he would show up at her house uninvited and text her that he loved her. She told him to stop, and the day before he disappeared, he sent her one last message that read, "The world can get better, but I'll have to take all the time I can, or we can, whatever to name it. I'll either see you again or never see you again." According to Daniel's sister, he had also started listening to a podcast recommended by the girl, and it changed the way he saw the world. The podcast by spiritual teacher and self-help author Eckhart Tolle showed him how to view things in the world in a positive energy, to avoid negative energy. On July 19, 2021, a rancher found Daniel's blue Jeep Renegade in a ravine less than 3 miles from his job site. The Jeep had rolled over on its side and the airbags were deployed. It also appeared that the sunroof had been kicked out. Inside, there was evidence that the driver had been wearing his seatbelt at the time of the crash. Also found inside the vehicle were several of Daniel's belongings, including his cell phone, wallet, keys, and the clothes that he was wearing on the day that he went missing. Police suggested to David that Daniel might have run away from his family to become a monk or join a cult somewhere, but David didn't buy it. Frustrated by what he believed to be a lack of progress and effort made by the police, David hired former police officer and vehicular crime investigator Jeff McGrath to help him find his son. McGrath's team ran an analysis on the vehicle. According to the Jeep system, the vehicle was involved in a collision around 1 p.m. on the 23rd, approximately 4 hours after Daniel was last seen, but no one knows what happened during that gap in time. Their report also uncovered a few abnormalities. They also found that the damage on the Jeep didn't match the terrain. A few months later, Buckeye police ran their own analysis on the vehicle. According to their findings, the Jeep was involved in a rollover crash, which was the only car crash recorded in the vehicle system. The Jeep's speed increased right before the impact, leading investigators to believe that the driver was attempting to drive up the other side of the ravine. More than 40 ignition cycles were recorded after the crash, which could indicate the driver trying to restart the engine, though it's unclear how many of those ignition cycles occurred during the tow recovery. Police also stated that the 11-mile discrepancy between the crash data report and the odometer reading wasn't as strange as it may seem. In July of 2021, a human skull was found south of the Jeep crash, but it was later determined that the remains did not belong to Daniel. Additional remains were also found during the search, but they belonged to animals. According to David, several other human remains have been found in the area during their search for Daniel. David recently called for Daniel's case to be changed to a criminal investigation due to what Jeff McGrath and his team uncovered about the crash. On the change.org page he runs, David says, "Since my son has been reported missing, the Buckeye Police Department has done very little. The shortcomings of the Buckeye Police Department have been plentiful. Unfortunately, I have found that they have lied or approached the investigation in a nonchalant manner on several occasions." Daniel's family and friends continue to search for him in Arizona, supported by a crew of volunteers. Daniel is described as 5 feet 8 inches, African-American man, approximately 165 pounds, with black hair and brown eyes. He is missing part of his right forearm, including his hand. The family has set up a change.org petition and GoFundMe page to gather donations and increase interest in the case. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. The Hood River County Sheriff's Office in Oregon is looking for answers to a decades-long cold case. In June of 2003, human remains, a skull and mandible bone, were found off Forest Road 4410 on Mount Hood just east of Portland, Oregon. When police discovered the skeletal remains, they suspected they belonged to a female victim of homicide. But they knew it would take time to identify the victims since at the time, more than 100 women had been reported missing in Oregon during the 2 years prior. That process ended up taking 18 years, but in 2021, the Oregon medical examiner was able to positively identify the remains as 36-year-old Tisha Dyer. According to family and friends, Tisha was living in Portland, Oregon at the time for disappearance, but hadn't been seen or heard from since 2002. Mount Hood, where the remains were found, is a remote area, and her family say that they couldn't think of a reason for Tisha to be there, as she wasn't an avid hiker or involved in many outdoor activities. The Hood River County Sheriff's Office, in partnership with Crime Stoppers of Oregon, are offering a $2,500 reward for any information that leads to an arrest in the case. Anyone with information regarding Tisha's disappearance and murder can submit an anonymous tip at crimestoppers.com. There is very little on this particular cold case. 62-year-old Leon Francis was a husband, father, grandfather, and veteran of the United States Marines. He lived on Wind Drive in Newport News, Virginia with his wife, Daphne, until his disappearance on the morning of January 14, 2020. Daphne would be the last person to see her husband before he went missing. At 5:30 that morning, she was sitting in her den, talking to her daughter over the phone, when Leon came into the room carrying an umbrella. He kissed his wife and said good morning as usual. When Daphne asked what he was doing with the umbrella, he responded happy birthday, which was unusual, as it was not the birthday of anyone in their family. Daphne fell asleep on the couch after finishing her phone call. When she woke up at 7 a.m., Leon was nowhere to be found. He had left behind his glasses, identification, bank cards, and medication. A neighbor's security camera showed Leon walking, still with his umbrella, down a street 1 block south of Wind Drive at 6:49 a.m. The umbrella was later found behind a Wendy's. Near the intersection of that road and Warwick Boulevard, Leon had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in 2009 and had to take medication 5 times a day. His condition made it vital to locate him immediately so that he could be given his medications. It may also have contributed to why he seemed confused and left his home unexpectedly that morning. While Parkinson's disease is most well known for its physical symptoms, like tremors, it can also lead to cognitive complications. An extensive search for Leon was launched. His family spoke to the local press and used social media to spread the word about his disappearance. They received an outpouring of support from the community, and volunteers organized their own searches and passed out flyers. On Sunday, February 16, 2020, a man and a woman were taking a walk in Lee's Mill Historic Park, on a path that took them along the Warwick River. They saw a man's body floating in the water, approximately 20 feet away from the shoreline, and called the police. When the authorities retrieved the man's body, he was wearing the same clothes Leon had last been seen in, and had Leon's patient identification bracelet from a recent visit to the VA on his wrist. A vigil at a local middle school had previously been organized for that night by the community and Leon's family. The vigil was originally organized in honor of Leon's 63rd birthday, which had been 3 days earlier, and still went on as a night of prayer after the discovery of his body. The body found on February 16th was initially believed to be Leon based on his clothing and the patient ID bracelet. The state medical examiner's office was able to later confirm this identification using DNA, fingerprints, and dental records. According to the Newport News Police, the body had been in the water for some time. On March 13th, the medical examiner in Norfolk announced that Leon's cause of death was drowning with exposure to environmental cold. His death was ruled an accident. While the medical examiner was able to provide Leon's family with some answers, there are still lingering questions in the case, like what Leon was doing in that area and how he ended up in the water. Leon's body was found approximately 1.5 miles away from his home. It is possible that he simply became disoriented and went in the wrong direction as he tried to walk back home. According to Leon's wife Daphne, Leon's legs sometimes gave out from under him, and he occasionally needed help getting up, both as a result of his Parkinson's disease. If he accidentally went off the path towards the marshy area of the river, it is possible he could have stumbled and gotten stuck in the mud, but this scenario remains just a theory. Leon's family held services for him on February 27, 2020, where he was remembered by his friends, family members, and volunteers who had helped search for him. We're so grateful for all the efforts and the prayers and the time that people took away from their families to make us part of their life. Daphne Thomas Francis told the Daily Press, "It's just amazing what people did together." Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. On May 24, 2017, 27-year-old Zachary Wills left his home in Lompoc, California, en route to his aunt and uncle's home in Las Vegas, Nevada. From there, Zachary would be going with his uncle to Lake Powell to help him do work on a houseboat he owned. Zachary never arrived at his aunt and uncle's home, and no one in his family could reach him by cell phone. His brother reported him missing on May 26th. Zachary's black 1994 Honda Civic was found upside down in a culvert off of Highway 166, east of Soda Lake Road in Maricopa, California. Police believed that the car had been involved in a single vehicle accident and had not been located during the extensive searches made in 2017 because it had been hidden by dense brush off the side of the highway. However, Zachary's remains were not inside the vehicle, and there were no obvious signs of him nearby. On February 26, 2020, Zachary's mother Elizabeth announced in the Facebook group created to help in the search for her son that recent DNA tests had confirmed that Zachary had died at the site of the accident. Several days after his vehicle was located, one of the searches of the surrounding area had turned up 2 bone fragments. Tests would show that only one of them was human. Zachary's parents provided samples of their DNA to compare to the DNA from the other fragment. This testing would show that the bone fragment belonged to Zachary. With just this one small bone available for post-mortem examination, the cause and manner of Zachary's death could not formally be determined. We don't know how or exactly when he died. There will be a lot of assumptions, but no one knows, Elizabeth Wills said in her statement. Keep his memory alive in your hearts, and may he rest in peace, knowing he was loved. Shortly before 4 p.m. on January 17, 2020, Margaret Helen Becker left her home in Sebring, Florida to run some errands at the nearby Southgate Plaza shopping center. Surveillance footage would later show her inside the CVS pharmacy in the shopping center, where she filled some prescriptions. According to other people inside the store at the time, she appeared confused. She left the pharmacy at 4:48 p.m., and her whereabouts for the next 77 minutes were unknown. She entered the Publix grocery store in the shopping center at 6:05 and purchased some bananas. Surveillance footage from the grocery store shows her looking disoriented and unsteady on her feet. Helen left the Publix at 6:17 p.m. She never arrived home. Authorities attempted to trace her movements using her cell phone, and the OnStar system installed in her blue 2018 Chevrolet Colorado, but were unsuccessful. They believed that activity at the nearby Avon Park Air Force bombing range may have interfered with the signals. The bombing range would later play an important part in the investigation. On the night of January 31st, authorities learned that a blue Chevrolet Colorado had entered the bombing range without stopping at the guardhouse at approximately 7:30 p.m. on January 17th, the day Helen disappeared. According to the person who had been manning the guardhouse at that time, the vehicle had been driven by a woman matching Helen's description, and there was no one else inside of it. The range had no gate or physical barrier to prevent vehicles from driving onto its property. Based on this sighting, a search of the range was organized for the following morning. Several teams covered the various roads and trails throughout the range, and a dive team came in to search the Kissimmee River off of a boat ramp on the range. At 1:50 p.m., divers confirmed that there was a vehicle in the river approximately 30 yards away from the boat ramp. It was Helen's truck. It was still in drive and 3 of its windows were rolled down. Helen's purse and cell phone were inside of the truck, but Helen was not. Divers would continue searching the water for her remains, but were unsuccessful. The formal search for Helen was called off on February 14th. Authorities are confident that there was no foul play involved in the case. Despite being in the water for so long, Helen's cell phone still worked after it was charged, and the Highlands County Sheriff's Office was able to use it to fill in the timeline of Helen's movements on January 17th. It appears Helen spent the 77 minutes after she left CVS and before she entered Publix in the parking lot of the shopping center. After she left Publix, she began driving north on US 27. Instead of turning left onto one of the 2 roads that would have taken her back home, she instead turned right onto Sebring Parkway. She made several more right turns which brought her to the bombing range and several more right turns after she was on the property that brought her to the boat ramp, which she appears to have driven off of, not realizing she was going into the water. Individuals with dementia are known to generally turn in the direction of their dominant hand when faced with a choice while they are in a confused state. Helen Becker was reportedly right-handed. While she has no documented history of dementia, some of her behavior on the day she went missing indicates that she may have been having cognitive difficulties at least on that day. She appeared confused and unsteady while performing her usual errands, and authorities later learned that she had attempted to pay for her bananas at the Publix using a bank card that she had previously reported as lost, before ultimately using cash to complete her transaction. The Highlands County Sheriff's Office is waiting on downloads of data from Helen's vehicle to see if they will provide any additional information, but they do not expect them to change the direction of the case or answer all of the questions in the case that may never be definitively addressed. This update has not been conclusively linked to a case previously featured on this channel, but since there is an appeal to the public for information involved in it, I have decided to include it in this video. In January of 2020, reporter Joseph Kohut of the Scranton Times-Tribune received an anonymous letter. Your story made me realize that it is not too late to tell what I feel I should have reported to the state police or the Scranton police that night more than 30 years ago. Letter opened. It was signed, perhaps just a foolish old woman. The writer of the letter claimed that one night, more than 30 years ago, she had driven onto Interstate 81 North at the music entrance. While on the interstate, she heard a female scream. She then saw a fire and heard the screams intensify. After the screaming stopped, she could smell burning rubber and fuel. The other people in the car with her, including her husband, dismissed the incident as teenagers throwing a party in the woods off of the interstate. But she could not shake the feeling that the female she had heard screaming had been killed. However, she never reported the incident. Authorities do not believe that the letter's author is foolish, based on some of the details she provided in her letter. There was information in there that the time frame fit with other high-profile cases that had gone on in the same time. Scranton Police Captain Dennis Lukashevitz told ABC 16 News. Based on some of the details relayed in the letter, the incident the letter describes may be tied to Frank Asselani. Asselani was convicted of the 1989 rape and murder of Renee Waddle. The burning body of the 9-year-old had been located along a private roadway. Asselani is currently serving life in prison. While he has only ever been convicted in this one case, Asselani is a suspect or person of interest in 3 other major unsolved cases in Scranton, which occurred between 1978 and 1987. I have previously featured one of these cases, the 1986 disappearance of Michelle Jolene Lakey. Jolene went missing on August 26, 1986, while walking to her home in Scranton after visiting her mother in the hospital. She may have gotten into a yellow car approximately a block away from her house. Scranton police are asking for the woman who sent the letter to come forward. There has been a lot of construction along the section of I-81 described in the letter, and they need more information from her in order to identify exactly where they need to search and narrow down the timeline in order to determine if what she heard and saw that night could be tied to any of their open cases, including Jolene's. They want her to know that she does not need to be concerned about getting into trouble if she comes forward, and faces no legal action for not reporting what she observed all those years ago. Nick Maas was born in the Netherlands in 1939 and emigrated to Canada in 1957. 2 years later, he began working as a clerk for the Bank of Montreal. He was employed by them for the next 35 years, steadily moving up to positions with more and more responsibility. His various positions had him working in Halifax, Montreal, and Vancouver over the years. He was an active member of the Dutch-Canadian community and belonged to and held leadership positions in professional associations for this community. Nick married and had 2 children, but that marriage ended in divorce. In 1984, he met the woman who would become his second wife, Lisa. Lisa had also been married before and was also an immigrant, having been born in China. In Vancouver, she was working as a hairstylist. The couple met at a hair salon on Cambie Street, where Lisa would cut Nick's hair. Nick did well in his banking career and eventually became the manager of the elite private banking center at the Bank of Montreal. At the beginning of 1994, he retired from his position at the bank but continued to work. He worked as a stock promoter and received a directorship at Turbine Technologies, a publicly traded company that was developing technology to reduce emissions from diesel engines. On August 10, 1994, Nick and Lisa were invited to join some of their friends at the Symphony of Fire fireworks display over Vancouver's English Bay. They had to turn down the invitation because they had a business dinner that evening. Nick was reportedly meeting with a businessman from California who had $10 million he was considering investing in Turbine Technologies. Nick made a reservation for 4 at his favorite restaurant, Trader Vic's in the Cole Harbor neighborhood of downtown Vancouver, for $830 that night for the dinner. No one showed up to the restaurant for the reservation and no one called to cancel it. The staff at the restaurant was surprised by this. They were familiar with Nick because he was a regular customer, and it was out of the ordinary for him to fail to show up for a reservation without at least calling to cancel it. The restaurant employee who took the reservation knew Nick and was able to confirm that it was in fact Nick who called to make it. 2 witnesses would later come forward, placing Nick and Lisa in the area of the restaurant around the time they should have been there for their meeting. Both of these witnesses knew the couple personally and claimed to have seen them on the night of the 10th at the Garden Lounge at the Weston Bayshore, which was next door to Trader Vic's. The couple was allegedly there from 6:30 to 10:30 p.m. According to the witnesses, Nick was drinking a bottle of wine and was dressed in a casual jogging suit. Lisa appeared to have come there straight from work, still dressed in the clothes she wore at her job. Neither witness believed that Nick and Lisa were dressed as though they were on their way to an important business appointment. The following morning, August 11th, Lisa made 2 phone calls from her husband's cell phone. She called the salon where she worked and left a message with a coworker that she had been called away for a few days for a court case. She then called Nick's business partner to say that he would be gone for a few days. Cell phone records would later show that the calls had been routed through a repeater on Bowen Island. This means that the calls could have been made from or near the couple's home in North Vancouver, or from a fairly large area along the coast. No one saw or heard from Nick or Lisa after these phone calls. After a few days, Lisa's sister became concerned and went over to the couple's home. When she arrived, she found the front door unlocked and the security system disarmed. There were 2 plastic zip ties on the floor by the front door of the home. The couple's 17-year-old Persian cat, Spider, was alone in the home with no food. According to Nick's children, he adored Spider and would never have left him uncared for. The couple's car was in the driveway, and their passports had been left behind. Their bank accounts were left untouched. While some have speculated that Nick and Lisa had entered some sort of witness protection program, the 2 main theories about their disappearance are that they met with foul play or that they staged their own disappearances. There have been numerous theories about what circumstances could have led to either scenario. Most of these theories could provide potential motives for someone to harm the couple, but could also be reasons why the couple would be fearful enough of being harmed to abandon everything and leave Vancouver. Nick's job with the Bank of Montreal had given him connections in some of the most affluent social circles in Canada, but his business relationships also gave him ties to several financial scandals. One of his associates, Fred Hoffman, conned members of Vancouver's Dutch community out of millions of dollars with a Ponzi scheme. He, along with more than $10 million, vanished in April of 1991. Almost a third of that amount had been taken from a retired anesthesiologist from Seattle, who had been introduced to Hoffman by Nick Mass. Nick had also been a personal banker for Harry Mall. One of Mall's many endeavors had been creating the Pine Ridge Capital Group, which collapsed in 1992. A scandal arose during this collapse when millions of dollars worth of investors' funds went missing. Mall eventually moved to the Cayman Islands. One of Nick's business relationships also had him involved in an active legal case in 1994. Nick and Lisa went missing just before Nick was due to testify against a businessman who had been one of his former clients and was on trial for allegedly stealing $100,000. However, Nick was only an incidental witness, according to Crown prosecutors. His disappearance was still successfully used by the defense lawyers in the case to get a 7-month-long delay in the trial. Nick Mass did appear to be under an unusual amount of stress for most of 1994, according to those close to him. He had become unusually secretive and tense, and appeared to be concerned for his safety. This stress was very apparent to others at a funeral he had attended just before his disappearance. He was reportedly unusually distraught, and said he wanted to get out of town for a while. After Nick and Lisa went missing, authorities also learned that they had made a secret trip to the Cayman Islands in April of 1994. They had not told any of their friends or family members about the trip. During their time there, the couple set up a bank account and had their wills drawn up. Nick's son, who was also named Nick, hired a private investigator named Ozzy Caban to look into his father and stepmother's disappearance. The two men had a falling out after Caban came to the conclusion that Nick Sr. and Lisa had staged their disappearance. He based this belief off of statements from witnesses he would not identify, and a claim that he was able to use his connections to learn that Nick and Lisa's account in the Cayman Islands had more than $100,000 in it. Other reports indicate that the account held $50,000 worth of stocks. Authorities say that they have not found any evidence that Nick and Lisa fled their home to start a new life somewhere else. While Nick's position in the exclusive private banking center of the Bank of Montreal had given him connections to politicians, wealthy businessmen, and multimillionaires, it should be noted that Nick himself was not as wealthy as his clients. His highest annual salary from the bank was reportedly $85,000. While this is certainly not a small salary, and is equivalent to more than $130,000 today, Nick's assets were nowhere near those of the clients whose money he helped manage. Nick and Lisa were hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt between their mortgage, credit card debt, and business expenses. Financial stress is of course a potential motive for Nick and Lisa to have wanted to run away voluntarily, and Nick's position in the financial community may give the impression that he could afford to do so. However, while some of Nick's clients could have certainly financed such an action, it is unclear how Nick and Lisa would have been able to do so. Financial considerations aside, Nick Mass Jr. believes that his father was too straight-laced and conservative to take the sort of risks involved with faking his disappearance and starting a new life. In 2001, he, his sister Tanya, and Lisa's sister Loretta petitioned the courts in British Legally Dead. Authorities also believe that Nick and Lisa were victims of some sort of crime, even though the exact nature of that crime remains unknown. On July 30th, 2019, shortly before the 25th anniversary of the couple's disappearance, the North Vancouver detachment of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police held a press conference with Nick's children, Nick and Tanya, to appeal to the public for information. Perhaps the time that has gone by would allow somebody to come forward now that otherwise might have remained silent in the past, Nick Mass Jr. said at the press conference. Nick and Tanya also announced that they were doubling the amount of the reward they are offering for information in the case from $25,000 to $50,000. Despite the amount of time that has passed since they have seen their father and stepmother, and the fact that they believe them to be deceased, Nick and Tanya still hope to find answers about what became of Nick Sr. and Lisa. Everybody loses their parents at one time in their life, but then you have a funeral and we don't have that, and that part has been extremely difficult. Tanya said at the press conference, "I think it will be the greatest gift we could ever receive closure." Two of her colleagues went to her apartment off of Eldon Dotson Drive to check on her. Inside the apartment, they found Janet's body. She had been sexually assaulted and shot. Investigators followed up on possible leads for years after Janet's death, but could never identify her killer. They were, however, able to collect a DNA profile from samples found at the crime scene and entered evidence into the FBI Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, in hopes of finding a match to a suspect, but it came up empty. As technology improved, so did investigators' chances of solving the decades-old cold case. In late 2020, a Texas Department of Public Safety grant, called the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative Program, gave Bedford police the funding and resources that would change everything. Investigators got to work bringing in a genealogist and using public records to establish a family tree for the suspect based on the DNA profile collected from the crime scene. They were able to determine the suspect's name and reached out to his relatives, and to confirm the DNA match via kinship analysis completed by the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification. In September, they were able to ID Jeanette's murderer, Ray Anthony Chapa. Chapa lived less than 1,000 feet from Janet, a neighboring apartment complex, but had no known connection to her. He died in January 2021 from a terminal illness in North Texas and are working with the FBI to uncover other potential offenses. Jeanette's sister Rebecca remembers her as someone who loved to joke around and make people laugh. She hopes the other family members of Chapa's victims find peace and closure. In February of 2018, Patrick D. Laneserta was gunned down at his home in Deltona, Florida. The 25-year-old was newly engaged to his girlfriend, Vidi Devani, and the two were excited to start their life together, especially after the tumultuous relationship Vidi had with her ex-boyfriend, Gregory Bender. Vidi had broken up with Bender, a wealthy hedge fund manager, after discovering he had a wife. Though he claimed the marriage was a business arrangement, made so the wife's child could attend school in a specific district. After Bender and Vidya broke up, she met Patrick, but when Bender found out about their relationship, he began sending threatening texts and voicemails to the couple. The couple was granted a restraining order against Bender, in which he was ordered to surrender his collection of guns. For a few months, the threat stopped, that is until the morning of February 27, 2018, when Vidya received a call from Bender. She didn't pick up but was suspicious of why he'd been reaching out again. He started to worry for Patrick's safety and rushed over to his home, but it was too late. She found Patrick dead from a gunshot wound in his driveway. Padette immediately suspected Bender, but the police had no evidence to arrest him. Then Bender's soon-to-be ex-wife, Damara Sanchez, sent in a tip. She'd heard about the murder on the news and realized it sounded similar to what she found in one of Bender's notebooks. He had written out a detailed plan of how he would kill Patrick and had drawn a map of his property indicating how he would go about undetected. When she confronted Bender about what she'd found, he said the notes were just a fantasy. After receiving this information from Damara, the police had probable cause to search Bender's home. Almost immediately, they found the plan and map in a trash can. Just as Damara described, although the murder weapon was never located, police found ammunition and a shell casing that matched those at the crime scene in Bender's home. According to prosecutors, Benders lured Patrick to the front door by calling him from a burner phone, pretending to be a delivery man and saying that he had a package for him. When Patrick opened the door, Bender fired. Bender was arrested in connection to Patrick's murder and did not take the stand during the trial. On May 28, 2021, after 2 hours of jury deliberation, he was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Patrick de la Cerda. He is currently serving a life prison with no possibility of parole. In 1992, Helen Cardwell was ready to start fresh. The 35-year-old had just moved to Niles, Texas from West Virginia and was living at the Leaning Tower YMCA. She was about to start a new job as a technician at the Lutheran General Hospital. But when her sister came to visit her on November 7, 1992, she found Helen strangled to death in her room. The police were never able to identify a suspect, but were able to gather DNA samples from the crime scene. Eventually, the case went cold. In 2020, Niles Police Department formed a cold case team dedicated to solving Helen's murder. Using modern forensic technology previously unavailable to them, they were able to extract a DNA profile from samples found at the crime scene and matched it to a now 72-year-old man named Richard Sisto. Sisto had been living in the Niles area at the time of Helen's murder, though police wouldn't say if there was a known connection between the two. But even though police were able to identify Sisto as a suspect, they had a hard time locating him until a search in a police database revealed he was already in custody for a parole violation in Harris County, Texas. In August of 2021, police traveled to Harris County to interview Sisto and collect another DNA sample, and in October, he was charged with the murder of Helen Cardwell. Helen's sister Noka expressed her gratitude to the NAZ police. The Genesee County Sheriff's Office has arrested a longtime suspect in the 1997 homicide of Mary Pryor. 80-year-old Mary was a fixture in her town of Lennon, Michigan. She went to Mass 6 times a week and visited the same cafe for lunch and dinner every day, which made her murder all the more shocking to the community. On February 27, 1997, Mary's brother called the police after visiting Mary's home and finding the door ajar. Her beloved dog inside, but no signs of Mary. Her body was discovered around 2 p.m. that day, wrapped in a blanket in a swampy area behind her home. She had been sexually assaulted and beaten, and the perpetrator was never found. In 2002, Genesee County Sheriff Chris Swanson was assigned to the case. He'd kept a copy of Mary's obituary on his desk to make sure he never forgot his mission. In 2004, he interviewed a suspect named Michael Burr, who was a junior in high school at the time of Mary's murder. Though Burr couldn't be arrested at the time due to lack of evidence, they were able to get a DNA sample from him. Swanson told him that next time he saw him, he'd be in shackles and charged with murder. And in November of 2021, that promise came true. Thanks to technological advances in DNA testing, investigators were able to compare the DNA collected from the crime scene to the DNA collected from Burr. And it was a 1 in 1.9 octillion match. Burson has been charged with murder, criminal sexual conduct in the first degree, and kidnapping. It has been 35 years since 4-year-old Jessica Gutierrez was taken from her home in Lexington County, North Carolina, and now the man responsible for her disappearance and murder has been charged. On the night of June 5, 1987, Jessica was sleeping in her room with her 6-year-old sister Becky, but when their mother Deborah woke up the next morning, Jessica was nowhere to be found. The room was littered with paper, the front door was open, and the curtains were torn off the window. Becky told her mother that Jessica had been taken by the man with the magic hat and beard. Their mother then called the local law enforcement, who conducted an unsuccessful search of the area. Investigators determined that someone had broken into their home and had taken Jessica before leaving at the front door. A single fingerprint was found on the windowsill of the bedroom. The fingerprint was later matched to a longtime family acquaintance, Thomas McDowell, after he was convicted of a rape in 1997. He served 10 years in prison for the rape and was released in 1997 and still remained a suspect in Jessica's disappearance. During his time in prison, McDowell allegedly confessed to a cellmate that he kidnapped a girl in Lexington County and that he'd been wearing a tall cowboy hat at the time. The cellmate reported the information to the police, who repeatedly searched the landfill but found nothing. Authorities questioned McDowell, who offered to confess to the crime in exchange for immunity from prosecution, but that was denied. At the time, there wasn't sufficient evidence to prosecute McDowell for the crime. But in 2020, the Lexington County Sheriff's Office cold case team took another look at Jessica's case. With the help of the FBI, analysis from the Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team, and prosecutors from the South Carolina Attorney General's Office. Attorney General Alan Wilson said newly discovered information helped them confirm McDowell was the perpetrator. Jessica's mother, Deborah Gutierrez, was relieved her daughter's killer has finally been caught. "I'm glad God brought me to see it," she said. "I prayed he would bring me through it, and we waited for this a long time." In January of 2022, McDowell was taken into custody and charged with kidnapping, first-degree burglary, and the murder of Jessica Gutierrez, who is still missing and presumed dead. He is currently being held at the Wake County Detention Center without bail. Marissa Rolf Harvey was 15 years old when she found out she had a half-sister. She had been adopted when she was 3 and was living with her family in New York when one day in December of 1977 her newfound sibling showed up at her door. Marissa was thrilled about the discovery and begged her parents to let her visit her sister in San Francisco in the coming spring. They reluctantly agreed, and she flew to the city during her Easter break. Arriving on March 24, 1978, she spent the weekend with her sister and on Monday asked to go horseback riding, which was one of her favorite hobbies. Her friend's sister dropped her off at the Golden Gate Park stables, but they were closed and Marissa was left stranded and alone. When Marissa didn't return home to her sister's apartment later that day, she called the police and reported her missing. The next day, a man found Marissa's body in Sutro Heights Park, less than half a mile away from the stables. According to the coroner, Marissa had been badly beaten and strangled to death. The San Francisco Police Department conducted an exhaustive investigation, but ultimately could not identify a suspect in Marissa's murder. Then, in October 2020, the department's cold case unit reopened Marissa's case. Supported by advanced technology from the department's Forensic Science Division, the police identified a suspect, 76-year-old Mark Stanley Personette from Conifer, Colorado. On December 15, 2021, Personat was arrested by Jefferson County Sheriff's Office in Colorado and held without bail on the charge of being a fugitive of justice. His criminal record included aggravated sexual assault, and the San Francisco Police Department is asking other law enforcement agencies to review similar cold cases in which Personat may be a suspect. Investigators in Connecticut have solved a 2001 cold case after re-examining a conch shell used in the murder. Rosemary Monise of New Bedford, Connecticut was found dead in her home on March 23, 2001, when her father stopped by to pick her up for a doctor's appointment. The 41-year-old had been beaten to death with a fireplace poker, a conch shell, and a cast iron fireplace kettle. Since her purse had been emptied out onto the floor and money was missing, police initially assumed it was a robbery, but there were no signs of forced entry. After ruling out 2 suspects, the case went unsolved for almost 2 decades. Then in 2019, the Bristol County's District Attorney's Office and Massachusetts State Police Unsolved Crime Unit reopened the case. Investigators reviewed photos of abrasions and contusions on the victim's face, and they were caused by the conch shell's exterior, and determined that the perpetrator had to have put his fingers inside the conch shell to strike the victim. When they re-examined the conch shell and tested it for DNA, they found a full profile. They uploaded the profile to the National DNA Database, and it led to a match. It was Rose's half-brother David Reed, who was a pallbearer at her funeral. Reed's DNA was already in the database after a 2003 assault and robbery of a different New Bedford woman. He had been arrested and charged for the crime, but he never showed up to trial. In August of 2020, investigators interviewed Reed about Rose's murder. Soon after, he fled his home in Massachusetts and evaded authorities for the next year by traveling across the country. He was eventually located and arrested on September 10, 2021, while he was staying at the Providence, Rhode Island Mission Shelter. In November, he was indicted on charges of murder and armed robbery in connection with Rose's death. He is currently awaiting arraignment. On February 24, 1999, Minnie Sorano, known as Minnie to friends and family, disappeared. That day, the 13-year-old left school as usual and was heading to her home in the Bronx, but she never made it. Her mother reported her missing that night, and soon after, the community began searching for her, putting out flyers with a large reward for information. For days later, a homeless man found her body wrapped in a trash bag inside a dumpster behind a video store, had been strangled, and there were signs of sexual abuse. Authorities questioned family members, neighbors, classmates, and teachers and conducted a nearly year-long investigation, but found no leads. DNA samples were gathered and submitted for tracing with no success. For years, the case went unsolved until 2020, when police used familial DNA technology to crack it. A DNA sample taken from semen found in the victim's sweater was submitted to New York's convicted offender DNA database, and they found a partial match. They built out a family tree based on the results and narrowed down their suspects to 3 relatives, one of whom was a man named Joseph Martinez. When they reviewed the evidence from the case again, they discovered that Martinez was a tenant at Minnie's apartment building during 1999. They also had notes from the initial investigation quoting Martinez saying that he remembered seeing Minnie around the building. In recent years, Martinez became known as Jupiter Joe, a sidewalk astronomer who would set up his telescope on New York City sidewalks and offer viewings and mini lessons about the stars to kids. In Minnie's notebooks, investigators found lists of astronomy-related websites, as it was something she was also interested in. Investigators collected a DNA sample from Martinez, and it was a match to the DNA found on the sweater. In November of 2021, he was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. He pleaded not guilty to the charges and is due back in court on March 7, 2022. This case marks the first time familial DNA technology has been used to solve a cold case in New York City. Adam Brundage was a 26-year-old father of 2 living in Quakertown, Pennsylvania. He was an avid reader who loved his 2 cats. In early October of 2004, he abruptly disappeared. The last confirmed sighting of him was at his workplace, an organic food warehouse in Milford Township, Pennsylvania, on October 1st. He was reported missing several days later to police by his ex-girlfriend, who was the mother of his children. She told them that while Adam generally liked to stay home and keep to himself when he was not at work, it was unusual for him to be out of contact with her. Unable to get a hold of him by phone, she had also gone to his home to check on him, but he had not been there. The usually reliable employee had also begun missing chefs at work. Quakertown police investigated Adam's disappearance, but they ran out of leads to follow by the end of November. The case remained unsolved until January of 2020. On January 21st, Bucks County District Attorney Matthew Weintraub held a press conference to announce that Adam's case was solved. Unfortunately, Adam had gone missing because he had been killed in October of 2004. Authorities had located his remains, and his killer had already been arraigned in the case earlier that morning. Adam had been killed by someone who had been under suspicion ever since he went missing, his roommate Damon Smoot. Adam had purchased the town home he lived in using money he had inherited following his father's death, and had taken Smoot in as a roommate to offset the costs of home ownership. According to DA Weintraub, Smoot was jealous of Adam's possessions and essentially took over his life after killing him. After Adam went missing, Smoot continued living in Adam's house. He also began using all of Adam's belongings and driving Adam's maroon 1997 Mercury Cougar, which had been his prized possession. Smoot told Adam's stepmother that Adams had given him the house, the car, and his belongings, but could never provide any evidence or legal documents supporting this. He also gave various excuses for Adam's absence, saying that he was in states ranging from Wisconsin to West Virginia, for reasons ranging from needing cancer treatment to being in to running away from paying child support. In April of 2019, Adam's case was reopened, and authorities eventually found evidence, which has not been publicly specified, tying Smoot to his disappearance. On January 9, 2020, prosecutors met with Smoot and his attorney in prison, where Smoot was serving a 5 to 10-year sentence for an unrelated assault to confront him with this evidence. At that time, Smoot, in the words of his attorney, chose to unburden his soul and confess to Adam's murder. In 2004, Smoot had been working as a heavy machine operator at the Haynes and Kibble House Quarry in Chalfont, Pennsylvania. Adam needed some sand to fix a grading issue on his property, and Smoot told him to meet him at the quarry after hours to buy some on October 4th. After Adam arrived at the quarry, the two men got into an argument. Smoot retrieved a baseball bat from his vehicle and used it to hit Adam in the back of the head with enough force to cave in his skull. This did not kill Adam immediately, however, so Smoot used his hands to cover Adam's nose and mouth until he stopped breathing. He then buried Adam's body in a berm in the quarry. Smoot provided authorities with the exact location where he had placed Adam's body in the quarry. Even with the specific information and the help of a cadaver dog, it took a full day and night of excavating to remove all of the rock covering Adam's remains and recover them. If Smoot had not chosen to cooperate, Adam may never have been found, both because of how deeply he was buried, and because investigators believed that Smoot had disposed of Adam somewhere on several acres of farmland he had access to, and were planning on focusing their searches for Adam there instead of at the quarry. On January 21st, the morning of the press conference, Smoot was arraigned on one count of criminal homicide at the Bucks County Courthouse. He waived his right to a preliminary hearing, and his bail was set at $1 million. Smoot's lawyers and the district attorney's office have reached an agreement, which has been approved by Adam's family, in which Smoot will plead guilty to third-degree murder and receive a sentence of 20 to 40 years in prison. 57-year-old Naomi Sanders lived alone in apartment 12 of the Oakwood Gardens Apartments in Vallejo, California. On February 26, 1973, she spoke on the phone with one of her friends at 8:30 p.m. She mentioned that she was about to cook her dinner. After hanging up the phone, she began cooking 2 steaks. It is believed that one was for her own dinner and the other was being prepared for her pet poodle Cindy. The steaks would still be on the stove, only half cooked, when another resident of the apartment complex entered Naomi's apartment the following day, around 5 p.m. The neighbor found Naomi's partially nude body on her bed. Cindy the poodle was standing guard over her owner. Naomi's autopsy would later reveal that she had been raped and strangled. Naomi had no known enemies or scorned former boyfriends for police to investigate. She had been employed by the Brooks Security Service for 2 years, leaving her position there just 2 months before her death. Her former supervisor there, a retired police detective, volunteered to help with the investigation, but also said that Naomi had not received any threats while working for him. Naomi had left her job at Brooks after 6 months of trying to balance it with her second job. She worked as the building manager for her apartment complex and had a large cardboard sign with the word "open" written on it in her front window. Informed passersby that there were apartments available in the complex and that she was available to discuss them. Potential new tenants would routinely come speak with Naomi about the complex, meaning her killer could have faint interest in living at Oakwood Gardens as a means of getting inside her apartment. Naomi's case went cold, and several decades would pass before authorities found new avenues of investigation. In 2014, Naomi's clothes were resubmitted to the California Department of Justice Laboratory for testing. These tests revealed semen stains, from which a DNA profile was developed. Unfortunately, there was no match to the profile in the Cody's database. In 2016, police tried to use familial DNA to identify Naomi's killer. They compared the DNA profile from the crime scene to offender databases first in California and later nationwide, to see if a relative of the contributor of the DNA had committed a crime and therefore had their DNA profile on file. They did not find any such relatives. In 2018, detectives turned their attention to using genetic genealogy to solve the case. While they could not identify any relatives of the killer in offender databases, they still hoped that they could locate some in public genealogical databases. They partnered with Parabon Nanolabs. An analysis completed in April of 2019 identified 2 potential suspects. Detectives traveled to Louisiana, where they covertly obtained a DNA sample from one of these potential suspects from an item they observed him throwing away. Testing on this sample eliminated him as a suspect. Their other potential suspect was deceased and his remains had been cremated, leaving authorities without the opportunity to test his DNA directly. This man did have children, however. They visited one of his sons who lives outside of California, and he provided them with a sample of his DNA. On February 27, 2020, exactly 47 years after Naomi's body was discovered, the Vallejo Police Department announced that they had identified her killer, Robert Dale Edwards. Edwards was 22 years old and living in Vallejo at the time of Naomi's murder. His father was a previous co-worker of hers. He could not be arrested for the crime because he had passed away from a drug overdose in Napa County, California in 1993. He had spent the 2 decades between Naomi's murder and his own death building an extensive criminal record, with charges ranging from assault to driving under the influence to attempted murder. Edwards was identified through his niece, 26-year-old Sophia Edwards, who had uploaded her DNA to the GED-Match database. The young mother and in-home care provider living in Napa, California, barely knew her father and was using the database to try to find out more about her family. The amount of DNA she shared with the profile generated from Naomi's clothing allowed investigators to focus in on her family tree. While Sophia never met her uncle, she did have old pictures of him and was shocked to see his face on the evening news following his identification as Naomi's killer. Edward's son, who provided his DNA to police in order to confirm his father's involvement in Naomi's case, has not been publicly identified. His half-brother, however, has spoken publicly about the case. Robert Edwards is a 42-year-old married father who lives in Fairfield, California. He does not know his half-brother, who provided his DNA to police, and he did not know his father. His mother left his father when he was just a few months old, because of his violent behavior, which she had viewed as a reaction to the time he had spent serving in the Vietnam War. While the younger Robert Edwards knew his father was not a good man, he was still shocked to learn of his involvement in Naomi's case. All this was shocking to me. I knew my dad was not a nice man after the war, but never thought he was a murderer or rapist, he told the Daily News. Naomi had no children of her own, but having 9 brothers and sisters, she has a large extended family. Following the announcement of the identification of Robert Dale Edwards as her killer, 2 of Naomi's nieces released a statement on behalf of their family. Many family members directly affected by the loss of Naomi have also passed, and unfortunately, They cannot be afforded the truth as to what happened, they wrote. Those of us who do remember the stories of Naomi's life and untimely death can now feel closure thanks to the determination and teamwork of the Vallejo Police Department and partnering law enforcement agencies. May Naomi now rest in peace. In 1992, 57-year-old James Essel was a beloved father and a small business owner. He owned the Sugarloaf Mountain Market, a convenience store in Comus, Maryland. In the early morning hours of March 22, 1992, a customer discovered James' body inside of his store. He had been hit over the head and stabbed 29 times. What little money had been in the store's cash register had been taken. James had apparently fought fiercely for his life, as blood from his assailant was left behind at the scene. The blood was the only real clue investigators had to work with. Comus was small, rural, and close-knit. The robbery was unusual for the community, and the murder was almost unthinkable. James had only owned his store for less than 2 years, but was already a fixture in the community, which rallied around his memory and his family. Unfortunately, James' case quickly went cold, and the town of Comus and James' family spent year after year without answers. In 2017, however, police were able to use new developments in DNA technology to generate a new lead in the case. They contacted Parabon Nanolabs, who used their snapshot DNA analysis service to generate images of the individual whose blood was left behind at the scene, one showing him as a young man, and another of what he may look like having aged 30 years. These images were released to the public, but did not result in an arrest in the case. Authorities then turned to genetic genealogy to help identify James's killer. Using public genealogy databases, they were able to identify relatives of the perpetrator and eventually identified a potential suspect in late January of 2020. That suspect was 51-year-old Hans Hewitts, who was living in Virginia Beach. On February 10, 2020, investigators obtained a warrant to collect a DNA sample from Hewitts. On February 11th, they obtained the DNA sample from him. When asked about the case, Hewitts only acknowledged once getting into a fight with someone many years before, but he was unaware that the other man had died. The DNA from the cheek swab taken from Hans Hewitts was quickly processed. It was a match to the blood left behind at the crime scene. On February 12, 2020, detectives from the Montgomery County Police Department in Maryland, in conjunction with the U.S. Marshals, went to arrest Hewitts on charges of first-degree murder, felony murder, and robbery with a dangerous weapon. Authorities went to Hewitts' home on Maitland Drive, where they found him inside of his car. When they tried to arrest him, Hewitts pulled a gun. A neighbor was recording the brief police standoff from down the street, and on the video, police can be heard telling Hewitts several times to put down his weapon. He did not. Hewitts was then shot and killed. The exact details of the moments before the police decided to fire, and their reason for doing so, have not been released, as there has to be an official investigation into the incident. The detectives involved in the shooting have been placed on administrative leave until the investigation is completed, as is the standard procedure. Is a private investigator and retired Washington, D.C. police officer. The couple had only been married for 6 years, but had known each other since they were children. Haiti does not believe that her husband, who did not have a criminal record, committed the crime, and has stated that she will be working to clear her husband's name. James Essel's family, however, does accept the results of the investigation and the answers they have provided. I wish the guy could have served time for the crime, but it's just a relief. James' daughter, Perpetua Edwards, said, "To know that it's over is a huge relief for me and my siblings." An 844 AA had originally been part of the American Airlines fleet. It was manufactured in 1975 and flew for the airline for more than 25 years. In January of 2002, the aircraft was sold to Aerospace Sales and Leasing, a corporation in Miami, Florida, after American Airlines retired it from service. Because of the airline's strong maintenance program, N844AA was still in very good condition. The following month, the plane came to the attention of the man who would bring it to Africa, Keith Irwin. Irwin was a 57-year-old entrepreneur from South Africa. He had recently entered into a joint venture with Cargo Air Transport Systems, a company based in South Africa that had recently been awarded a contract to transport fuel to diamond mines in Angola. Angola's ongoing civil war had made ground transportation to the mines essentially impossible. Transporting goods by air was exceptionally dangerous, but still had a higher chance of success. The joint venture's sole investor supplied $450,000 for the acquisition of an aircraft and flight crews from America. Irwin originally traveled to Miami to meet with a different corporation and lease a different aircraft. He originally planned to lease a 727 for a year and hire 2 flight crews, each with 3 members, for the same amount of time. This deal fell through and Irwin lost $140,000 in the process. The 6 crewmen were still available, however, and Irwin soon met Maury Joseph, the owner of Aerospace Sales and Leasing, who had 3 recently retired 727s for him to choose from. Under his agreement with Joseph, Irwin would purchase an aircraft rather than lease it. The sale price was $1 million, and Joseph agreed to remove the passenger seats from the plane's cabin to make room for the 10 tanks Irwin had purchased to transport fuel. Irwin provided a down payment of $125,000 and was supposed to pay the rest of the amount he owed within 30 days. Irwin was allowed to take the plane to Angola, but Joseph sent one of his employees, Mike Gabriel, along with the 6 crew members to ensure that the remainder of the money would be paid. Keith Irwin, Mike Gabriel, and the 6 crewmen left Miami on N844 AA on February 28, 2002. However, they did not arrive in Angola until March 14th. Irwin and his partners had failed to acquire the necessary permits to land the plane in Angola, leaving them in limbo for 2 weeks. They were finally able to pay the necessary fees and secure the required permits to land at the airport in Luanda. During this time and through this process, Irwin also spent all of the remaining $185,000 that had been invested in the joint venture. Several of the 6 crew members who had come to Angola to fly the 727 had previously worked in various parts of Africa. But the conditions they faced on this job were far worse than any they had previously worked under. The apartment where they were housed in Luanda had no drinkable water or electricity and was near an open sewer. They were concerned about the heavily armed security guard assigned to the project. Of most concern to them was the fact that their passports had been taken away from them by the company that had hired Irwin's joint venture to transport fuel when they arrived in Angola. Their request to get the passports back was denied by the company, and they only received them after getting the U.S. Embassy to intervene. 2 out of the 6 crew members flew back to the United States once they had their passports back without receiving any of the salary they were owed. The other 4 crewmen stayed on in hopes of eventually being paid once all of the problems surrounding the venture were worked out and they were able to begin making the flights they had been hired to perform. Those flights would not begin for several more weeks. In addition to losing 2 of the members of his crew, Keith Irwin also lost his partner, Cargo Air Transport Systems, and had to find a new backer for the venture. He ultimately found one, but his 727 would now be making fuel deliveries for a new client. Despite all of the problems with the business side of the operation, the 727 finally began making delivery flights in April. In 2010, one of the members of the flight crew spoke to reporter Tim Wright, but asked that his name not be disclosed. He was an Air Force veteran with 30 years of flight experience, and he described the conditions he faced during the delivery flights he made while working for Irwin as the most dangerous flying in the world. He and his fellow crew members had to base their approaches and landings to their destination at the diamond mines around avoiding ground fire, and the runways they had to land on were not paved, so their landing gear would often get stuck in the dirt. The runways were also not flat, and they witnessed other planes from competing companies crash on them. After seeing one of these accidents, the anonymous crew member fabricated a story about his mother being ill as an excuse to ask for time off to return to the United States. He did not return to Angola. By the end of April, all of the members of the crew had returned to the United States. Keith Irwin was able to find a local crew to continue flying the plane and making the fuel deliveries, but by May of 2002, his long-troubled venture completely collapsed. Around this time, Irwin believed he was being followed by someone hired by one of his partners. He began blocking the door of his hotel room at night. One night, he heard someone insert a key card into the lock in his door, and the door unlocked. Whoever unlocked the door could not enter the room because of the chair Irwin had wedged under the door handle, and was scared off when Irwin began yelling at him. The hotel's night clerk would later admit to hotel security that he had accepted a bribe to provide a copy of the key card to Irwin's room. Irwin left the country the following day, leaving the 727 behind in Angola. Despite its age, N844AA was essentially in mint condition when it was first brought to Angola, but after only 17 delivery flights, it was practically falling apart. The harsh flight conditions it faced, as well as the stress of carrying tanks it was not designed to transport, rendered the plane worthless. It would never be of any value again. Another one of Maury Joseph's clients would later say, "You can't put water tanks full of fuel in an airplane and expect it to be good. Totally stupid." The plane remained parked at the airport in Luanda, accruing parking fees on top of the other fees and bills the aircraft had accrued during its brief period of use in Angola. Maury Joseph and aerospace sales and leasing also had not been paid. Irwin made 2 payments towards what he still owed on the plane upon his return to Africa, but then stopped sending money before actually paying off the rest of the $1 million he had agreed to pay for the plane. Joseph had fired Mike Gabriel in the midst of all the chaos in the spring of 2002 for failing to secure these payments or bring the plane back to Florida in their absence. Joseph traveled to Nigeria with another 727 he was planning to sell. He brought with him a man named Ben Charles Padilla, who was a freelance flight engineer and aircraft mechanic. Padilla was a native of Pensacola, Florida, and the son of a millwright, and his talent for working with all things mechanical had been clear ever since he was a child. He had an interest in aircraft from an early age and earned a private pilot license in addition to all of his technical certifications. He lived in Florida with his fiancée of 15 years, his stepchild and child, but was often away from home as he worked around the world as a freelancer, usually in locations across Africa and Asia. Ben came to Nigeria with Maury Joseph and the 727 to help with its transport and to explain its systems to its new owner once the sale was fully negotiated. In April of 2003, Joseph then sent Padilla to Luanda to oversee the process of making the repairs on N844AA necessary for it to return to service. While the plane as a whole was essentially junk at this point, it had relatively new engines which were still of value. In order to recoup some of the losses he incurred from his disastrous deal with Keith Irwin, Joseph put the engines alone up for sale. He found a buyer for them in Johannesburg, South Africa, and needed N844AA flown there so that they could be removed from the plane and the sale could be completed. In Angola, Padilla was able to make arrangements with Air Gemini, an airline based out of Luanda, to make the necessary repairs to the 727 at their repair station at Quatro Delaware Figueroa International Airport. He hired local mechanics and oversaw the work, which progressed according to plan. In May, he hired crew members, again through Air Gemini, to help him fly the newly functional plane to Johannesburg on May 26th. On May 25th, Padilla and John Matantu, a worker from the Republic of the Congo Padilla had recently hired, took the plane out of Air Gemini's hangar and onto a runway in order to run its engines as part of a systems check. It was during this check that the plane mysteriously took off and disappeared, along with Ben Padilla and John Mutantu. The following day, Marie Joseph was waiting for the plane in Johannesburg when he got an angry call from someone from Air Gemini, demanding to know why the plane had left Luanda ahead of schedule and without the crew that had previously been arranged for the flight. Knowing that he had not authorized any such changes and that Ben Padilla would not have made any such changes without his permission, Joseph notified the U.S. Embassy in South Africa that a large aircraft had been stolen and called his wife back in Florida to ask her to contact the FBI. Given the fact that the plane was seemingly stolen just 20 months after 9/11, American intelligence agencies immediately took interest in the plane's disappearance. The State Department sent word to every American embassy in Africa about the plane going missing. U.S. Central Command considered sending more fighter jets to one of their joint bases in Africa. While there have been reports of the CIA and NSA looking into the case, only the FBI and State Department have had official investigations into the plane's disappearance. The FBI ended their investigation in 2005. There are, of course, a myriad of other reasons why a 727 might be stolen. To be sold on the black market, to transport goods on the black market, to be disassembled for parts, and so on. Not everyone believed that the plane had actually been stolen, however. According to now retired U.S. Marine General Maston Robeson, who was the commander of U.S. forces in the Horn of Africa at the time of the plane's disappearance, the intelligence community also considered the possibility that N-844AA had gone missing as part of an insurance fraud scheme. It was never clear whether it was stolen for insurance purposes by the owners or whether it was stolen with the intent to make it available to unsavory characters. He said in 2010. He had lost a lot of money on a plane that was now largely in disrepair, and he had a history of questionable business practices. In the 1990s, Joseph had been the CEO of a cargo airline that ultimately went bankrupt. The Securities and Exchange Commission brought a civil case against him, alleging that he defrauded investors in the airline and falsified its financial documents. Joseph had to pay a fine and was barred from acting as an officer in any publicly traded company as a result of the case. He was obviously contacted by the FBI about his plane's disappearance and volunteered to take a polygraph. The client, who was set to buy the plane's engines, had been with Joseph when he learned that the plane was missing and does not believe that he played a part in the disappearance because of the genuine shock and confusion he displayed at the news. Ben Padilla's family is also adamant that he would not play any part in any sort of insurance fraud. If anybody would say to me that my brother was involved with this, they're full of it, Joe Padilla, Ben's brother, said in 2010. "'Cause I know my brother. He's not gonna do nothing crooked. I know that for a fact." Despite the fact that he was often away from his family, working outside of the United States for various private companies in what were often remote locations, Ben Padilla managed to stay in close contact with his family. The last communication they had from him was an email sent shortly before he went missing. The email was in response to one informing him that his mother had just had a heart attack. He promised to contact her as soon as he could. He never got the chance to before he went missing. According to Ben's family, someone else must have been on the plane that day and forced it to take off, as Ben would not have willingly participated in illegal activity of any kind. It would be easy to dismiss this belief held by the family as a result of their personal bias. But some of the facts surrounding the case do support the idea that Ben was forced to take off on N-844AA. The fact that the plane took off at all supports the idea that an unknown person or group of people was involved in the 727's disappearance. It took 3 people, a pilot, a first officer, and a flight engineer, to operate a 727. Only 2 people, Ben Padilla and John Mutantu, are known to have been on board at the time the aircraft took off. Furthermore, Ben Padilla did have a private pilot's license, but he was not trained to operate anything even remotely close to a 727. John Mutantu had no training as a pilot whatsoever. Ben could have filled the flight engineer role, but 2 other pilots would be needed to operate the aircraft. Ben had also made the arrangements with Air Gemini to take the plane out of the hangar this means that theoretically someone could have found out about the check and hid it on board the plane before it left the hangar with plans to take it over. The Padilla family continues to pressure the FBI to reopen the case and help them find answers about what happened to Ben. The Bureau says that this can only be done if new information is discovered. A Florida attorney began working with the family pro bono in 2004 to help facilitate their communication with the State Department and law enforcement. Almost no information is publicly available about John Mutantu, so it is unknown if he has a family who is also waiting and hoping for answers. Over the years, numerous theories have been proposed, and alleged sightings of the plane have been made. It was rumored to have been stripped for parts in Brunei. There was speculation that it was a plane that crashed off the African coast on Christmas, and a pilot claimed to have seen it at an airport in Guinea, its tail number partially painted over. None of these reports ended up being accurate. Perhaps the most obvious explanation for why the plane has never been found is that it crashed somewhere too remote, either on land or in the ocean, for it to be located. However, even if this is the case, the mystery about why it took off in the first place still has no answer. Furthermore, there have never been any sightings of Ben Padilla and John Mutantu, and their whereabouts remain unknown. In the early 2000s, the media in Mexico City began reporting a strange string of murders that followed a similar pattern. Women living alone over the age of 60 were being found robbed and murdered in their homes, primarily by strangulation. The crimes baffled the police, who was targeting the grandmothers of Mexico City. By 2003, 24 older women had been murdered. The media started to speculate it was a serial killer, given the unknown attacker the moniker El Mataviejitas, or the Old Lady Killer. Law enforcement scrambled to keep up with the killer. For many years, detectives dismissed the idea of serial killer that was preying on older women. But with the death of Maria de Los Angeles' Reaper on October 18, 2005, the Mexico City police started to take the case seriously. The police in Mexico didn't have a lot of experience investigating serial killers. Serial killers in the past had been identified as such after their capture. Detectives relied heavily on international experts for their investigation. The Deputy Attorney for Central Preliminary Investigations, Renato Sales Heredia, announced that there was enough evidence to support the theory that there was a serial killer at work. A 100-person team was dispatched to look into the case, led by Guillermo Ziz, who was notoriously known as the homicide prosecutor. It would be the largest manhunt ever undertaken in Mexico. Using evidence from the crime scenes and the victims involved, they were able to establish a modus operandi, or MO. The victims had been older women. They were all over the age of 60. Many lived alone in middle-class neighborhoods and usually were located near parks. There was never any sign of forced entry into the homes, and the attacks happened during the day, and the victims were robbed of cash and jewelry. Heredia told the public that they thought that there could be an accomplice, as described by a witness from the last murder, although an accomplice was never confirmed. Despite police recognizing the severity of the investigation, there was little movement made in the case. The investigators were able to establish the method by which the murders were being done, but little evidence about the identity of the murderer could be found. One small clue they did find about the identity was a possible written description taken in 2003 from one of the potential cases before it was recognized as part of the string of killings. Due to the strength needed to strangle someone to death, the police speculated that the person they were looking for was a man. They also believed that the killer was posing as some kind of official in order to gain access to the women's home, such as a medical professional or government worker. With little to go on, the murders continued as investigators scrambled to piece together whatever evidence they could. With the murders being officially investigated, people became wearier, and eventually the police were able to collect some eyewitness reports that gave more information about the previous incidences from 2003. With these first-hand accounts, the police were able to create an artist's rendition as well as a plasticine bust of the suspect. The witnesses had stated that they had seen a robust and manly-looking person leaving the victims' homes. The killer was also described as possibly wearing a wig and being quite tall. These descriptions convinced authorities to think that the murderer was a man dressed in women's clothing. The descriptions and renditions were released and then dispersed to police stations throughout the city's 70 sectors. The police also used these sketches to create brochures and posters that were dispersed to the public. Hundreds of tips flooded in with reports of people having similarities to the sketches, and law enforcement interviewed over 300 people, but all were released. The killer was often compared to Terry Poulin or the Monster of Montmartre. In 1987, Terry was arrested and convicted in Paris for the killings of over 20 elderly women. Similar to the unknown attacker in Mexico, there hadn't been any sexual nature to Terry's crimes. Terry was motivated by money. The young man was HIV positive and addicted to drugs. He had murdered the elderly women and robbed them and used the money to throw lavish parties. Knowing he didn't have long to live, he spared no expense on an extravagant lifestyle paid for by the stolen credit cards of his victims. He was arrested when an officer recognized him from a surviving victim's description, and Terry died in prison before his trial. Terry had dressed as a nurse and targeted elderly women. Police in Mexico believed Mataviejitas was also a male serial killer who was dressing as a nurse or some other profession that would elicit trust from the victims. Mexican police therefore modeled sketches after Tyrai based solely on similarities in victims. Due to the comparison to Tyrai, police in Mexico began to round up hundreds of people, and each was interrogated, fingerprinted, and released when it was determined that they didn't match the unknown suspect. The police had also been able to collect a set of fingerprints that matched at 9 of the crime scenes, as well as a shoe print from one of the recent crime scenes to use for comparison. The case continued, but police were only able to piece together a few other facts and a few more pieces of random evidence that led them nowhere. The fingerprints were sent off to a national public security system, but no matches were found. The majority of cases took place in Cuauhtémoc and Benito Juárez, although there were cases in 8 other boroughs which made narrowing a location difficult. Police also started to surveil parks and gardens, believing that the murderer was picking their victims while they were out on walks. It was also rumored that the police were paying older women to act as decoys in the parks to lure the murderer out, but this was denied by officials. At one point, it was thought that there might be a connection to the painting Boy in the Red Waistcoat by Jean-Baptiste Gras, as 3 victims that were killed close to each other in time owned a copy of the painting. The police also admitted later that it could have just been a coincidence. Investigators also attempted to fingerprint bodies in the morgue to see if they matched those at the crime scenes, thinking that the killer may have committed suicide. They found no print matches, and it was obvious that they were starting to run out of avenues of investigation. Investigators were able to discover that the murders primarily took place on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, helping them to narrow down the habits of their suspect. It was also found that the murder was often spotted wearing red or dressed as a nurse, further supporting the police's theory that Mataviejitas was acting as a medical officer offering benefits or services to gain the trust of these women. On January 10, 2006, Oliver Guzman Lopez was brought into custody as a possible accomplice while also being held for attempted robbery of an older woman. He was under house arrest while his testimony was being reviewed. It wouldn't be until January 25, 2006 that the true killer was finally found. Returning home, a man who was renting a room from 82-year-old Ana Maria de los Reyes was surprised to see a woman fleeing from his landlady's home. Upon further investigation, he found that Ana Maria had been strangled to death. He quickly called the police and chased after her. The police caught the suspect and were extremely surprised at what they unveiled. The serial killer was in fact a woman by the name of Juana Barraza. Although the police had believed up to this point that the serial killer had been a man, the combination of eyewitness details and her likeness to the artist's renditions they had secured led police to believe it could be her. They immediately took her into custody as they further investigated. When Juana was arrested, it was discovered that she had paperwork for medical benefits, a social worker ID card, and a stethoscope in her possession despite not being a social worker or a healthcare worker. She confessed to the murder of Ana Maria de los Reyes, and a media frenzy blew up around her. And photos of her and authorities at the scene of the crime were leaked before she was even fully remanded in custody. During this time, Oliver Guzman Lopez was found to have no relation to Juana and was released. According to the police, Juana would cruise public spaces such as gardens and parks, watching for older women who seemed to be alone, and then she would employ a few different methods of gaining access into their homes. It was also discovered that Juana had suffered a back injury during lucha libre and had been having issues recovering. The injury had been preventing her from competing as often as she needed to make enough money for her family. She had turned to shoplifting and breaking into homes to keep up with bills, but it still wasn't enough, so she started targeting seniors. One of these methods was offering to help with groceries of those walking home from the store, and then, as they talked, offering to do housework for these older women. Also, as previously theorized by police, she would go to women's homes with medical papers, an ID card, and stethoscope while pretending to be a social worker offering free checkups in order to discuss and provide pension benefits. In the case of Ana Maria, Juana had just gone up to her and asked for a glass of water, after which Ana Maria had invited her in. She would then usually strangle her victims using a variety of items, including tights, phone cables, cords to household appliances, and the stethoscope. Juana would then rob the place, taking small trophies while there, such as ornaments and religious objects. Juana dressed very conservatively and had a neat short cropped hair. Because of her appearance, she was able to move around the city freely without any concerns of suspicion, as the police had put out a call for a suspect that was male. Possibility that a suspect was a woman had completely contradicted everything they had assembled in their investigation. Since citizens were given this information, Juana had little to worry about as she continued to target these older women gaining access to their homes. Juana had even appeared on national television in the weeks before her capture. She was being interviewed for a lucha libre event. Although the program was broadcasted on national TV, No one, not the police or news media or members of the public, identified Barraza as appearing very similar to the sketches. Yet, when she was arrested, police officials praised the hard work of all officers involved, dismissing that it had been kind of a fluke of good timing that had led to her capture. The media relished comparing Barraza to the composite image models to reflect the killer, particularly the clay bust. Despite evidence tying her to the scene of the other murders, she only ever admitted to the murder of Ana Maria de Letreyes. When asked why she committed so many killings, all she would say is that she had gotten angry. Some claimed that she killed the victims because she needed money, as someone with a history of theft from their victims. Is it bad what you did? Barraza answered, yes, it's bad what I did because no one has the right to take the life of someone else. Barraza was subjected to numerous psychological evaluations. There had been a strong desire to prove to the people of Mexico that not only was Barraza guilty, but she was predisposed to a violent nature. They needed Barraza to fit the narrative that they had built with El Mataviejitas to ensure the public that they had the right person. Barraza's home was also on the outskirts of Mexico City, in an area known for being a lower-income neighborhood with the usual socio-economic struggles we see in more impoverished communities. It had high rates of crime and lacked infrastructure, and this was used as further evidence to distance Barraza from the general public. Juana Barraza was a 48-year-old single mother of 4 who lived in Mexico City, doing a combination of street vending and miscellaneous housework to support her family. Her oldest son had died tragically during a mugging when he was only 12. His attackers had killed him using baseball bats. According to her lawyer, Juana stated that she was proud to say she had kept things going on her own. She is proud of being both a father and mother to her children. Neighbors reported that the family was pleasant and kind. Neighbors and those who knew Juana and her family were shocked to discover that she had been the serial killer because they reported the family as being pleasant and kind. In her free time, Juana was a fan of lucha libre, organizing events for small-town celebrations, working as a popcorn vendor, and also participating in the amateur circuit. She performed as a rudo, a wrestler that acts like a bad guy in a match. She went under the name of La Dama del Silencio, or the Lady of Silence. Police asked her about this title, and she stated it was because she was a quiet person that liked to keep to herself. Juana had also described herself as rudo to the core. It was because of this hobby that Juana had the needed strength and technique to strangle people to death, as well as giving her a muscular appearance mentioned in many eyewitness reports. Upon further investigation, they also found an altar to Santa Muerta, a folk saint of death. At the time, the figure was associated with criminals and drug runners. Still, practices around the saint are becoming much more common and have less of a negative reputation as they are seen as the grantor of wishes and psychopomp of sorts. However, when she was arrested, it was used as further proof that she was guilty. In the eyes of the police, it was the saint only criminals associated with. Juana Barraza's past is not really confirmed, but according to a few sources and her defense team, she had been born in a village north of Mexico City in the state of Hidalgo in 1956. Juana never learned to read or write and grew up in a tragic situation. Juana's father was allegedly a police officer who was not in her life for long before her mother started seeing another man. Her mother was reported to be an alcoholic sex worker and was both neglectful and abusive to Juana. She would allegedly trade Juana to men for alcohol. At the age of 12, Juana was permanently traded to a man, reportedly for 3 beers. She had been kept as a prisoner for the man, and her mother lied to the rest of the family and claimed that Juana had gone off to start a new life with him of her own free will. Eventually, she was found and rescued by her uncles when she was 17. She then moved to Mexico City to start a new life. Juana was illiterate and forever resented her mother for the abuses she had suffered as a child. Her mother died when she was 20 years old due to alcoholism. It is due to this past that many believe that she was compelled to commit this murder spree later on. It even had been speculated that Juana's attacks were based on suppressed resentment towards her mother and the treatments she had received. Juana's mother had already passed away by the time of the murders, so through her heinous actions, Juana could live out the revenge that she was never able to get while her mother was alive. And this was a fact that was confirmed at her trial when she told the court, "I got angry. I killed old ladies because my mother mistreated me, bit me, cursed at me, and sold me to an old man." In the spring of 2008, Juana Barraza was sentenced to 759 years in jail for at least 11 of the murders that authorities could find solid enough evidence for. In Mexico City history, with that being said, it is suspected that she had killed up to 40 people going as far back as the late 90s. Juana is expected to serve about 50 years, as under Mexican law you can serve your sentences concurrently. She is now 64 years old and still has a long way to go in her sentence. She has had no further incidences in jail, and she is rarely given interviews to the media. Juana Raza has since become a folk figure under her moniker La Mataviejitas, appearing in television programs based on her story, having a Criminal Minds episode inspired by her, and having multiple songs and ballads written about her. Peggy Cox was dedicated to her family and her faith. The devout Catholic met her husband through a church group, and the couple became the proud parents of 2 daughters and a son. In 1973, Peggy's husband was injured in an automobile accident and went into a vegetative state. In 1977, Peggy made the decision to move her children from their home in South Nashville to Thompson Station, Tennessee, to be closer to family. She was a very active part of her children's lives, teaching them how to swim and making them feel safe enough to talk to her about anything. She did also have to rely on her own parents for help with her children, so that she could also care for her husband until he passed away in 1983. The stresses of providing such intensive care for her husband while also raising their children without him sometimes wore on Peggy, but she relied on her family, her church, and her love of reading to cope with them. She attended 8:30 a.m. Mass at St. Philip's Catholic Church every Sunday, and could read an entire romance novel in one day. In 1987, Peggy began working at a Hardee's restaurant in Franklin, Tennessee. For a while, she worked there with both her son Jude and her daughter Desiree. Desiree ended up leaving to go work at a local Kmart, but Jude continued working at the Hardee's as a cook. Friends of all 3 of Peggy's children would often go through the drive-thru of the restaurant just to say hello to Peggy while she was working because they were so fond of her. On February 1st, 1991, Peggy and Jude were both working at the Hardee's. Peggy was taking orders at the drive-thru and 20-year-old Jude was cooking just a few feet away from her. At approximately 11:45 p.m., a man ordered a roast beef combo at the drive-thru. Jude began preparing the order as the man drove around to the drive-thru window. Suddenly, Jude heard 2 gunshots. He instinctively dropped to the floor. When he looked over towards the drive-thru window, he saw his mother stumble backwards and fall to the floor. One of the bullets, which had come from a small caliber handgun, had struck her in the neck and entered her brainstem. She was rushed to Williamson Medical Center, but did not survive. Peggy had been murdered on her 49th birthday. Peggy was beloved by those who knew her, and police could not find anyone with a motive to harm her. The main theory they identified was that Peggy was killed in a botched robbery. According to Jude, his mother's killer would not have had enough time from when he placed his order to when the gunshots were fired to both drive around to the window and demand the money. It is possible that the assailant panicked when he arrived at the window and fired immediately without first robbing the restaurant. Several witnesses reported seeing a compact car speeding away from the Hardee's and getting onto Interstate 65 around the time of the murder. These sightings were the main clue in the case, but the car was never located, and Peggy's case soon went cold. In 2011, 20 years after Peggy was killed, Franklin Police Department Detective Darren Barnes requested to take over the case. Because of his position on an FBI task force at the time, he was able to utilize some of their resources in his investigation. In 2013, he was also able to present Peggy's case to the Vidic Society. The society, which only reviews a handful of cases each year, is a group of forensic experts and investigators from a variety of disciplines that provides confidential consultations about cold cases to members of law enforcement. Despite these efforts, and the efforts of Peggy's children to keep her story in the local media, the case has still not been closed. The population of Franklin, Tennessee has quadrupled since Peggy died, but her murder remains the city's only unsolved homicide. A $25,000 reward is being offered in the case. 46-year-old Rizwan Danani lived in Washington State, where he owned several businesses and restaurants. He was working at one of these restaurants a Dairy Queen in Auburn, Washington on March 31, 2016. He arrived at the restaurant around 7 p.m., with plans to be there until 11 p.m. Instead of leaving at that time, he called his family at it instead. He told them that he would need to continue working for a few more hours before returning to his home in an unincorporated area of King County, outside of Redmond, Washington. Surveillance footage shows Rizwan leaving the restaurant alone and on his own accord around 2 a.m. He has not been seen or heard from since. Rizwan had not been driving his usual vehicle that night, and the vehicle he had used to drive to the Dairy Queen was left behind in the parking lot of the restaurant. Rizwan's wallet, with all of his known forms of identification still inside of it, was found inside of the car. Rizwan either left on foot or got into an unknown vehicle. When he disappeared, he was also without his jacket and cell phone. 25 hours before Rizwan went missing, there had been a fire at another one of his restaurants, the Celtic Bayou, on West Lake Sammamish Parkway Northeast in Redmond. At 1 a.m. on March 31st, someone working at a nearby business heard an explosion and called 911. Redmond firefighters were able to quickly control the fire, which had not spread to any neighboring businesses, in part due to the restaurant's sprinkler system. There was extensive damage to the restaurant, but no one was injured in the fire. Police suspected that the fire was caused by arson, and the witness who had called 911 also reported seeing an unknown man walking away from the restaurant just after the explosion that started the fire. The authorities arrived at Rizwan's home at 5 a.m. that morning to inform him of the fire and to interview him. Rizwan had also gone into the Redmond police station to provide them with more information later in the day. Police do not consider Rizwan a suspect in the arson. They are concerned about his well-being and believe that his disappearance may be related to information he may have about the fire. He remains missing. Nancy Theobald was witty, clever, independent, and accomplished. At Indian Hill High School in Cincinnati, she was a member of the National Honor Society. She received a scholarship to study in France as an American Field Service exchange student during her senior year. She was accepted into the honors program at the University of Cincinnati and began her studies there in the fall of 1977 with plans to major in finance. Dr. Jerry Theobald had been a veterinarian at the Cincinnati Zoo, but decided to open a veterinary clinic in Florida. He, his wife, and youngest children made the move to Pompano Beach, Florida, but Nancy and her two older siblings decided to remain in Ohio. The three siblings lived together in an apartment on Deccabock Street in the Clifton neighborhood of North Central Cincinnati. In addition to attending school full-time, 18-year-old Nancy found a part-time job working at an Arby's restaurant that was less than 2 miles from where she lived. She began working there in October of 1977, and her supervisor immediately noticed that she was a conscientious worker who was always nice to everyone. Nancy was last seen at the Arby's on November 16, 1977, when she was working a late shift. She did not normally walk home after her night shifts, usually calling her brother Michael or a friend for a ride. On this night, however, she walked home. Michael would later report that he had left their apartment around the time Nancy got off of work, so he may have just missed a call from her asking for a ride. It has never been confirmed if Nancy did in fact call home, or any of her friends asking for a ride. Whether by choice or by necessity, because she could not find someone to pick her up, Nancy left the Arby's at 10:50 p.m. to walk home. She never arrived. Nancy's family knew that something was wrong as soon as she disappeared. According to her family, Nancy was simply too dedicated to her education and family to simply walk away from all of her responsibilities, and she had nothing to run away from. She also did not have a driver's license or a car. When she left the Arby's that night, it is believed that she only had $10 and her work uniform with her. Nancy remained missing for almost 6 weeks. On December 27th, a farmer discovered her body frozen into the mud in a creek bed on his property near Westchester in Butler County, north of Cincinnati. She was partially nude. A rope was around her neck and her hands were bound behind her back. Her autopsy would reveal that she had died of strangulation and had been sexually assaulted. Nancy's case went cold for decades. In 2000, the Butler County Sheriff's Office announced that they would be reopening 4 cold cases. One of these cases was Nancy's. Sheriff Harold Gabbard also announced that he believed that Nancy had been killed by the same person who had committed 2 of the other murders being reopened. 22-year-old Tammy King was a mother of a 4-year-old son, Michael. She went missing on October 25, 1982, while she was 5 months pregnant with her second child. Her body was discovered in Riley Township, Ohio, on November 13th. 24-year-old Victoria Hinzer was reported missing by her roommate a few days after she failed to show up for her shift as a waitress at a Red Lobster restaurant on October 20th, 1976. Her body was found in a wooded area in Ross Township, Ohio, by a man walking his dog on October 31st. All 3 women were attractive brunettes from Cincinnati. They had all been sexually assaulted and strangled before being left, either nude or partially clothed, in remote areas in southern Butler County. They were killed in different years, but at the same time of year, between the end of October and the middle of November. They had all recently been working in the food service industry. Victoria and Nancy were both still employed at restaurants, and Tammy had recently worked at one. The sheriff's office had a suspect they believed to be connected to all 3 cases, although they did not publicly identify him, beyond revealing that he was an inmate at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution. Investigators went there to interview him, but he did not wish to cooperate. This suspect was not the only lead the sheriff's office was following. They also hoped that the more advanced technology that was now available to them could provide them with a suspect. Hair and fiber samples were submitted to a lab for analysis, but the effort did not solve any of the 3 cases. Nancy's family has remained dedicated to finally resolving her case, even after decades without answers. Nancy's brother Joseph, who was just 11 years old at the time of her death, kept his sister's memory alive, in part by naming his youngest daughter after her. He lives in Florida, where he works as an insurance investigator. He has also been investigating Nancy's murder. While looking at Nancy's autopsy report, he noted that blood that may have belonged to her killer was found on her sweater. When he asked the authorities in Butler County about the blood in 2019, he was told that it had recently been resubmitted to the lab for new DNA testing. So far, this testing has not located a match to the DNA. If the contributor of the DNA can ever be identified, however, it may be the break in the case that will finally close it. Maurice Noel married his wife Jean in January of 1946, when they were both just 21 years old. The couple had 2 daughters, Kimberly and Candace, who went by Candy. In 1958, the family moved to Harchington, Nebraska. Eventually, Maurice would become the town's mayor, but not because he ran for the office. Rather, their respected businessman became the first person in town history to be elected to the position based solely on write-in votes. After decades of helping her husband with his dry cleaning business and raising a family with him, Jean passed away in 1978. In 1983, 58-year-old Maurice was living in Sioux City, Iowa. He owned and operated Pfeff Cleaners on West 26th Street. He had a girlfriend, Joyce Fish, who he had been dating for a few years. Joyce would be the last known person to see Maurice on Valentine's Day of that year. He left her home around 9:30 that night, driving his brown 1981 Fleetwood Cadillac. He has not been seen since, and his vehicle has never been located. Joyce and Maurice had plans for him to pick her up the following morning, February 15th, and drive her to work. Maurice never arrived. Joyce began making calls to try to locate him, but with no success. Maurice never arrived at the dry cleaners that day, which was out of character for him. Joyce and her daughter Lori reported Maurice missing to the authorities on the morning of February 16th. At the time of Maurice's disappearance, he was hoping that his daughter Candy would end her marriage. Her husband, Delbert Buchan, was facing charges that could earn him his 4th prison sentence. Maurice reportedly had found evidence supporting the charges against his son-in-law and was willing to testify against him. Maurice vanished before he had the chance to. While this certainly would have given Delbert a motive to get rid of his father-in-law, there is no evidence connecting him to the case. Candy passed away in 2004, and Delbert passed away in 2008. Today, Maurice will be 95 years old, making it unlikely that he can be found alive. Maurice's name is inscribed on his wife's tombstone, in hopes that one day the mystery of his disappearance will be solved, and he can be buried alongside her. In 1995, 21-year-old Ronald Duck Jr., who was known as Ronnie, was serving in the United States Navy and training to become an electronic communication technician. He had just returned from 3 months at sea in February and was set to board the USS Stephen Groves again on Valentine's Day. The weekend prior, he traveled from Naval Station Pascagoula to his hometown of Eclectic, Alabama, to visit his family before he was sent back out to sea. His wife, Suzette, was just weeks away from giving birth to their first child. After returning to Pascagoula, Ronnie was given liberty on the evening of February 13th. He and one of his shipmates spent the night in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, playing pool at a billiards club. They returned to the naval station at approximately 3:15 a.m. on February 14th. The guard at the station's first gate saw Ronnie in the car with his shipmate when they arrived back. When the car reached the second guard station, however, Ronnie was not in it. Ronnie allegedly got out of his shipmate's car to go speak with someone after passing through the first guard station. There was reportedly a sighting of Ronnie at 3:30 a.m. along the docks around the naval station, just 50 yards away from where he was supposed to board his ship later that day. Ronnie did not report for duty on the ship as scheduled. The Navy initially treated Ronnie as being absent without leave, but his family believed that his disappearance was not voluntary. Ronnie's maroon pickup truck was found in the parking lot at the naval station. The floorboards were muddy, and a carton of cigarettes and some sailor's ivory soap Ronnie had purchased for his time at sea had been left inside of it. Ronnie's wife had written him a $40 check out of their bank account so that he could cash it in order to have some spending money. But he never cashed the check. If Ronnie left on his own accord, he did so without any resources whatsoever. Ronnie's family believes he met with foul play, largely because he had told them that he feared for his life when he had visited them a few days before his disappearance. During a previous time at sea, Ronnie had been asked by a group of other sailors to buy them all some marijuana. The person he tried to buy it from turned out to be an undercover naval intelligence officer. Ronnie cooperated with the officer's investigation and testified against another sailor. That sailor received a less than honorable discharge from the Navy for smoking marijuana on board the ship a few days before Ronnie went missing. Ronnie had also helped Naval Investigative Services before, when he had been stationed in Michigan. Some of his current shipmates learned about this and believed that Ronnie was working undercover for them. Ronnie told his family that because of all this, he was receiving threats. Ronnie's family came to Pascagoula after he went missing to set up a command center and post flyers asking for information. They made frequent trips from Alabama to Mississippi to search for him, but with no success. Ronnie's mother, Beverly, spent most of her time trying to find new leads in the case so that she could find her son's remains and give him a proper burial for the 15 years following his disappearance. She passed away in 2010 without fulfilling this goal. Ronnie's wife Suzette gave birth to his daughter 6 weeks after he went missing. At the time, mother and daughter were not entitled to any help from the Navy. 30 days after Ronnie failed to report to his ship, since he still had not been found, he was declared a deserter and his family lost his benefits. The case has since been reclassified by the Navy, and he is considered missing instead of absent without leave. The daughter, Ronnie never had a chance to meet, will turn 25 this year, and lives in Alabama, where she works as a registered nurse. 38-year-old Lloyd Chamberlain lived in Merritt Island, Florida, and worked as a private commercial fisherman. On February 14, 2016, he left Port Canaveral on his Sea Pro Center console boat at approximately 10:30 in the morning with plans to return from his day of fishing by dusk. However, he never arrived home. When it was dark outside and Lloyd still had not arrived home, his friends and family went to Port Canaveral to look for him. There, they found his black Chevrolet Silverado pickup truck and his boat trailer, still parked in the parking lot. They did not find Lloyd or his boat, however. Around 10 o'clock that night, Lloyd was reported as an overdue boater to the Coast Guard. The subsequent search for Lloyd involved the Brevard County Sheriff's Office, the Coast Guard, and the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. At 11:32 p.m. that night, a ping from Lloyd's cell phone placed him 2.5 nautical miles off the shore of Indian Harbor Beach. The the Coast Guard sent out a search and rescue boat to the location. At 12:20 a.m., the boat was found coming ashore just a few miles northwest of the location where the cell phone had pinged. Lloyd was not on the boat. The boat had come in at Indian Harbor Beach, and all the items on board were examined. While the boat had taken on a lot of water, it was still seaworthy, and Lloyd's fishing rods were still in their holders. Lloyd's life preserver was still on board, but authorities hoped that he had a life jacket or some other sort of flotation device with him, and was still floating somewhere in the water, waiting to be rescued. Boats and planes searched for Lloyd from Barrow Beach to Flagler Beach, eventually covering an area of more than 5,000 miles. While the ocean had been calm on Sunday, when Lloyd went out, conditions were far more challenging on the following 2 days. Strong winds, rip tides, and high waves complicated the search effort. At 7 p.m. on February 16th, with Lloyd still not found, the search for him was called off. The decision was especially painful for Lloyd's girlfriend of 6 years, Melody, and her 3 children, to whom Lloyd had been a strong father figure. Their father, Melody's husband, had died during a boating accident in the Indian River 8 years before Lloyd's disappearance. Lloyd has still not been located. 70-year-old Yuba Thornton lived in Orchid Springs, Florida with her husband. On the morning of February 14, 1984, she drove him to work in nearby Winter Park, Florida. She did not, however, return to pick him up at 2 o'clock that afternoon as planned, and was reported missing to police. Yuba's 1981 Pontiac was located the following day, stuck in the mud in a rural area southwest of Kissimmee, more than 30 miles away from where she was last seen. The car was locked, and there was no sign of Yuba. Authorities feared that Yuba had somehow become disoriented and exited her vehicle, still in that condition, when she became stuck in the mud. Yuba had a heart condition and required 3 different medications, none of which she had with her when she went missing. Over 100 people were involved in the subsequent search for Yuba. Searching the swampy area near the south end of Lake Topocaliga was a challenge. Helicopters, tracking dogs, an airplane, off-road motorcycles, and 4-wheel drive vehicles were all utilized in the search. Members of the search team also looked for Yuba on foot and on horseback. No sign of Yuba was found during the search. The following month, investigators finally received a new lead when a hunter discovered a purse and umbrella near Lake Hatchnaha, further south from the original search area. Yuba Thornton's identification was inside the purse. This discovery resulted in a new search being conducted. A pair of eyeglasses believed to belong to Yuba was found, but not Yuba herself. She remains missing. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.